Most people think that Egypt is big, and in literal terms, Egypt is a very large state, over 1 million square kilometers. But in reality, 99% of the population lives on the shores of the Nile or the Delta region. Not a very large place to have 83 million people. Additionally, this is desert. As a result, if you're going to make anything beyond the actual banks of the Nile green, you need to have omnipresent irrigation canals. You can't drive a car over canals, which means that there are omnipresent bridges everywhere in Egypt. The cost of this sort of infrastructure is ridiculously high. So you take this isolation, you take this poverty, and what you get is an economy that is based on an exploited workforce. Ever since the time of the pharaohs, Egyptian labor has been some of the cheapest on the planet because you can't just walk out of Egypt, and everybody has to live near one of those omnipresent canals, which the state has built and which the state controls. And so unlike any other culture on the planet, the Egyptian people are utterly captive to the government. In the modern era, this has taken an interesting twist. One of the many aspects of Nasserism is complete military dominance of the political and economic system. And in this, the Egyptian government, the political elite, found a new way to exploit the masses. The military were given the ability to tap the banking sector. The banks, of course, hold the deposits of the Egyptian population. Well, in addition to exploiting a captive labor force, the military could now tap a captive savings pool. And the military would take out loans from these banks, or their firms that they controlled would take out loans from these banks, without really much of an intention of paying it back. This state of affairs lasted until really only about 7 years ago, when Gamal Mubarak started to give the central bank more authority over the banking sector. Until then, it was very hands-off because it was a cash cow for the military elite. Starting in 2004, the central bank started to enforce actual underwriting standards for the first time on Egyptian banks, and the percentage of loans that went out to the military started dropping, and by the time you get to 2011, they had almost disappeared altogether. However, this is still Egypt. It does not have an entrepreneurial culture, and so the money that the banks used to basically write off and hand over to the military elite was there, waiting to be lent out, but not a lot of people were borrowing. Enter the state. Under Nasser, under Sadat, and even under Mubarak, Egypt simply can't pay its bills. It splits the difference. It covers its budget deficit by selling debt on the international market. And as a result, Egypt became one of the most indebted states in the world. Once Gamal Mubarak's banking reforms took root, however, you had a new situation. The banks had extra money. The government still needed money, and so the government would sell its bonds to the banking system. All in all, the overall debt level did not change that much, but for the first time in millennia, the Egyptians were no longer completely dominated by what was going on outside of its own borders. It actually owed its debt to itself. This degree of domestic funding actually allowed for a number of other beneficial side effects, mostly unintended, to occur as well. For example, Egypt now has a mortgage market. It didn't have one 10 years ago. Now, of course, as we know, in 2011, the military has thrown a bit of a coup. Gamal Mubarak's efforts to dominate the Egyptian system for himself, starting with the economy, were what ultimately forced the military to act against him. And so now we don't have a parliament anymore. Now we don't have a constitution anymore. And the idea that the central bank will be the one institution that survives all of this with its authority intact, well, that's pretty doubtful. It's highly likely that the military will go back to what it was doing just a few short years ago and start using the banks as its personal cash cow again, which means that Egypt's debt problems are right back at the top of the list.